My name is Nora Bennett. I'm 30 years old, and a few weeks ago, I heard my own father explain very calmly why I should not be seen in public with my brother. I wasn't part of the conversation. I wasn't invited into it. I was standing in the hallway, barefoot on cold tile, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. I remember that detail because my hands were shaking just enough for me to notice it. My father's voice carried out of the living room, sharp and precise, the way it always was when he thought he was being reasonable. "Your brother's in-laws are elite," he said. "Do you understand that? They're elite. We can't risk this." There was a pause, the kind where someone else must have nodded. "Don't ruin this, Nora." He said my name like a warning, like a flaw that needed to be managed. I stood there frozen, staring at the small chip on the rim of my mug, listening as my existence was reduced to a potential embarrassment. My brother had just gotten engaged to a woman whose life looked like something pulled from glossy hotel magazines, private resorts, charity galas, people who wore confidence the way others wore jewelry. And suddenly, my life, my very normal, very real life had become a threat to the image my family was trying to build. No one mentioned what I actually did for a living. No one talked about the nights I spent rebuilding broken systems or the weekends I gave up to help struggling businesses stay afloat. None of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was how I looked, how I spoke, how unpredictable I might be in a room full of people they desperately wanted to impress. To them, I wasn't a professional. I wasn't an adult woman with a career. I was still the awkward daughter, the one who asked uncomfortable questions at dinner, the one who didn't instinctively know which fork to use or when to laugh at a joke that wasn't funny, the one who made things heavy. While they packed suitcases with tailored suits and carefully chosen dresses for a New Year's Eve engagement party at a luxury resort, I was quietly removed from the equation. No invitation, no discussion. Just a decision made for everyone's benefit. They didn't say I wasn't welcome. They said it would be better if I stayed home. My brother tried to soften it later. He always did. He talked about the crowd, the donors, the business partners, the pressure of first impressions. He said things like optics and strategy, as if excluding me was a smart move instead of a deeply personal one. "You know how you get," he said gently, not meeting my eyes. "You ask those heavy questions. You don't really play the game. Play the game." As if being myself was some kind of liability clause. My parents framed it as protection. Protection for me. Protection for him. Protection for the future they were so excited to imagine. They told themselves I'd be happier not dealing with the stress, that I wouldn't enjoy that kind of environment anyway, that it was kinder this way. But standing in that hallway, listening to my father talk about me like a loose thread that needed to be tucked away, I understood the truth. This wasn't about my comfort. It was about control. They didn't want me near the people they called elite. They didn't want me anywhere close to the world they were trying so hard to enter. And they definitely didn't want anyone knowing I was part of the family. What they didn't know, what not one of them knew, was that the same elite family they were rearranging their lives to impress had already trusted me with something far more important than first impressions. They had trusted me with their numbers, with their failures, with the survival of their business. For months, I had been working with them quietly, under a different name, unseen and unrecognized, rebuilding the very foundation of the world my family was desperate to belong to. While my parents worried I might embarrass them at a party, the people they idolized were relying on my work to keep their doors open. And on the night they tried to hide me, to erase me from their carefully curated picture, they had no idea how close they were to seeing that picture explode. Have you ever been treated like the family embarrassment, only to realize you were the one holding all the power? Because this story doesn't end with me staying home. It ends with a room full of people turning around, staring at a framed photo on the wall, and saying my name out loud right in front of everyone who thought I didn't belong there. Stay with me. You'll want to hear how that night unfolded. I didn't always think of myself as an embarrassment. When I was younger, I honestly believed I was just wired a little differently. At family gatherings, while the other kids ran through the yard chasing each other, I sat at the plastic table near the grill, quietly counting how many hot dogs people took and wondering why Uncle Mike always left before dessert. I noticed patterns. I noticed habits. I noticed the things adults didn't want noticed. I asked questions that made the air shift. Why would you invest in that company if their debt was so high? Why do we say we're doing fine with money if mom works 2 jobs? Why does everyone pretend not to hear it when grandpa brings up the same story every year? At first, people laughed. They patted my head. They called me curious. Then the laughter stopped. Conversations changed when I walked up. Adults lowered their voices or redirected the topic to something safer. Eventually, they stopped inviting me into the circle at all. After every gathering, my parents would pull me aside like they were staging an intervention. "Nora," my mother would say, her voice tight but controlled, "can you please just be normal for once? Smile. Talk about school. Don't interrogate people." My father would nod along, already frustrated, already tired. "You don't need to analyze everything," he'd add. "Just fit in. Fit in, like it was a simple choice I was refusing to make." Meanwhile, my older brother Ethan seemed born knowing exactly how to behave. He laughed at the right moments. He complimented the right watches. He knew when to ask about golf and when to nod thoughtfully without saying much at all. Adults leaned toward him when he spoke. They called him mature, polished, easy to be around. I was none of those things. One night, at a formal dinner after Ethan's high school graduation, everything crystallized into a single moment I still remember in uncomfortable detail. The restaurant was crowded and loud, the kind of place where everyone wore light-colored clothes and spoke a little too carefully. I stood too close to a waiter, asking him about tips and wages, genuinely curious, and my elbow caught the edge of his tray. The marinara sauce went everywhere. Red splashed across a woman's pristine white dress. The sound of conversation collapsed into silence. I remember the heat rushing to my face, the sharp smell of tomatoes, the way every pair of eyes snapped in my direction at once. My mother's face drained of color, then flushed deep red. My father grabbed my arm, hard enough that it hurt, and leaned in close. "This is exactly what I mean," he hissed through clenched teeth. "You don't belong in these settings." That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood there, frozen, feeling like something essential about me had finally been named and dismissed. After that, I stopped trying. I stopped forcing smiles that felt unnatural, stopped rehearsing small talk in my head before family events, stopped pretending I enjoyed rooms that made me feel like I was constantly one misstep away from ruining everything. If being myself meant humiliation, then I would find another way to exist. That was when I turned fully toward numbers. In high school, I taught myself spreadsheets the way other kids learned video games. I liked how formulas behaved, how logic rewarded patience. In college, while my classmates posted photos from frat parties and weekend trips, I stayed up late running A/B tests on website layouts for a tiny bed and breakfast that couldn't afford a real marketing agency. I watched how small changes created measurable results, how clarity emerged from chaos. For the first time, I felt competent without needing to perform. I studied business analytics and computer science, discovering that I could take messy, overwhelming data and turn it into clean answers. Hotels and guest houses started coming to me with the same problem: empty rooms, shrinking bookings, quiet panic behind friendly front desks. I worked through nights in my dorm room, staring at charts at 3 a.m, adjusting pricing and ad strategies until the graphs finally bent upward. Back home, none of that translated. When I mentioned landing my first real client, my mother smiled politely and said, "So you're still doing that online thing?" My father waved it off. "It's just temporary. She'll get a real job eventually." Ethan, on the other hand, went straight into law, joined a corporate firm, and instantly became the golden boy again. They introduced him to friends as our future partner at a big firm, their pride and joy. When I showed up to family dinners in jeans after 12-hour consulting days, my mother whispered, "Could you at least pretend you're not working from your bedroom?" That was when something inside me shifted. If they were never going to see my value in their rooms, at their tables, under their rules, then I would build it somewhere else, quietly, without asking for permission, without needing their approval. And while they were busy polishing Ethan's image, I was laying the groundwork for a life they wouldn't recognize until it was already standing right in front of them. Once I stopped trying to earn my place in rooms where I was already being judged, something unexpected happened. The noise fell away. The constant self-checking, the rehearsed smiles, the second-guessing of every sentence, it all went quiet. I didn't feel lighter exactly, but I felt clearer. If I wasn't going to be welcomed for who I was, then I didn't owe anyone a performance. I leaned all the way into numbers. At first, it was just a refuge. Spreadsheets didn't flinch when I asked hard questions. Data didn't roll its eyes or tell me to soften my tone. If something didn't make sense, it was because there was a pattern I hadn't found yet, not because I was too much. I loved that. I loved how honest it was. Cause and effect, input and outcome. No guessing games. In college, while everyone else seemed to be living inside group chats and weekend plans, I built small experiments late at night. I'd take a struggling website and test different layouts, change a headline, shift a button, adjust a price by a few dollars and watch how behavior changed. I wasn't chasing perfection, I was chasing understanding. When the first tiny bed and breakfast emailed me to say their bookings had picked up, I stared at the message longer than I probably should have. It wasn't dramatic. No confetti. Just a quiet confirmation that what I was doing worked, that I worked. From there, the requests came slowly, then steadily. Another guest house. A small motel on a highway people rarely noticed. A boutique hotel run by a couple who were one bad season away from closing their doors. They all had the same problem. Empty rooms, marketing budgets bleeding out. A sense that something was wrong but no idea where to look. I knew where to look. I spent nights hunched over my laptop, coffee going cold beside me, tracing numbers back to their sources, where guests dropped off, which ads brought curiosity instead of bookings, how pricing stayed frozen while demand shifted underneath it. It felt like solving a series of puzzles that no one else had the patience to finish. When the graphs finally turned upward, when revenue lines bent instead of flattened, I felt something I'd never felt at a family dinner. Relief. Pride. Quiet. Certainty. Back home, none of it registered. When I mentioned juggling multiple clients, my mother nodded politely and asked if I was still thinking about applying for something more stable. When I explained performance metrics or revenue models, my father's eyes glazed over. It's good experience, he'd say, the way people talk about internships, but it's not a real career. Ethan's career, on the other hand, was always real. After law school, he joined a corporate firm and stepped effortlessly into the role everyone expected him to play. My parents introduced him to friends with a glow in their voices. He's going places, they'd say. He knows how the world works. They talked about his future like it was a shared investment they were already collecting returns on. When I showed up to family dinners exhausted, hair pulled back, laptop bag still over my shoulder, my mother would lower her voice and say, "Could you at least pretend you're not working from your bedroom?" As if the problem wasn't my exhaustion, but the optics of it. At some point, pretending became unbearable. I registered my own consulting business and gave it a name that felt neutral and solid. I stopped explaining myself at dinner tables, stopped trying to translate my work into language they might approve of. I started saying no to invitations that came with an unspoken warning attached. If I already knew I'd be treated like an afterthought or a risk factor, I simply didn't go. While my parents focused on polishing Ethan's image, his suits, his connections, his future, I focused on something else entirely. I focused on results. I learned how fragile companies could be beneath their polished exteriors, how close even luxury brands were to panic when numbers slipped the wrong way. And I learned how much power lived in understanding those numbers better than anyone else in the room. I didn't announce my wins. I didn't post about them. I let them stack quietly. Each successful turnaround added another layer of confidence I didn't need to defend. I wasn't building a story that sounded impressive at parties. I was building something sturdier than that. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the part of my life my family would never understand until it collided head-on with theirs. While they were obsessed with appearances, I was learning how outcomes are made. While they worried about who belonged in which rooms, I was becoming the reason some of those rooms stayed open at all. I wasn't trying to prove them wrong. I was just finally building a world where being myself wasn't a liability, and where one day that difference would matter more than any polished small talk ever could. The more I leaned into that world of numbers and outcomes, the more invisible I became to my family, and strangely, the more grounded I felt. I stopped measuring my days by whether anyone approved of what I was doing and started measuring them by results. Did the system work better today than it did yesterday? Did a struggling business get a little more breathing room? That was enough. I formalized what I'd been doing quietly for years. I registered my own consulting business, gave it a name that sounded steady and forgettable, and built a simple website that explained exactly what I offered and nothing more. No flashy language, no promises I couldn't back up, just data, strategy, and results. I didn't tell my parents about it. Not because I was hiding, but because I was tired of translating my life into something palatable. When invitations came in for family events, I started listening to the tone beneath the words. If it felt like a test, I declined. If it came with an unspoken request to behave, to soften, to not ask the wrong questions, I stayed home. I chose my work instead. It felt less lonely than sitting at a table where I was already halfway erased. And the work kept coming. Small hotels reached out first, then mid-sized properties, owners who were exhausted and anxious and out of ideas. They didn't care how polished I sounded or what dress I wore. They cared about whether I could stop the bleeding. I could. Not every time. Not perfectly. But often enough that my calendar filled and my confidence followed. I learned something my parents never did. Beneath the luxury branding and glossy photos, most companies were fragile. Even the ones people whispered about with admiration. Especially those, when things went wrong, image didn't save them. Understanding did. That understanding is what brought Harrington and Vale into my life. It was a sticky Austin afternoon, the kind where time stretches and your brain feels slow no matter how much coffee you drink. I was half asleep over a spreadsheet when an email popped up with a subject line that was misspelled and urgent. Urgent mid-size resort chain in trouble. Can you help? It came from a small agency I'd freelanced for before. They were panicking. Their clients' bookings had collapsed after the pandemic. The marketing budget was hemorrhaging money. Expectations were high, and patience was gone. The client was a luxury brand, big name, big ego, very little margin for failure. I clicked the attachment, just a logo and a few terrifying charts. A few hours later, my phone rang. "This is Graham Harrington," the voice said. "Measured, controlled, tired at the edges. We've been told you can pull numbers out of the fire." He asked if we could keep the call audio only. No cameras, no introductions, just data. That was fine by me. I didn't need to be seen. I never had. For the next hour, he laid everything out. Flagship properties sitting half empty, competitors overtaking them. A previous agency that had burned through a 7-figure budget with almost nothing to show for it. Board members breathing down his neck. Deadlines looming. "We need someone who actually understands what's broken," he said. "Not someone who just makes pretty slides." I should have been intimidated. Harrington and Vale was the kind of name my parents would whisper with reverence if they saw it printed in a magazine. But as he talked, all I felt was focus. This wasn't magic. It was a system with blind spots. I asked for access to their booking platform, ad accounts, website analytics. He paused, then agreed. Within days, I was deep inside years of data. The patterns were almost loud once I knew where to look. Pricing that hadn't adapted to demand shifts. Ads targeting the wrong demographics in the wrong cities. A mobile checkout process so frustrating it practically shoved guests out the door. I built a plan and sent it over. No fluff, just steps. Tests. Risks. I told them up front it wasn't safe, that it would involve cutting campaigns people were emotionally attached to and changing pricing models they'd defended for years. Graham listened. Then he said something that surprised me. "If your numbers are right," he said, "we have nothing left to lose. Do it." For the first round of tests, I structured part of my fee as performance-based. If I failed, I made almost nothing. If it worked, we both won. I didn't do it to be brave. I did it because I trusted the math. The first month, the graphs twitched. The second month, they climbed. Occupancy rose. Revenue followed. Panic softened into relief, then into excitement. Late one night, Graham called me again, his voice lighter than before. "You have no idea what you've done for us," he said. "We're putting together something to mark this turnaround, a case study wall at our main resort. We want your name on it." I laughed and told him I preferred staying behind the scenes. He insisted on a headshot anyway. I sent one over and didn't think much of it. To me, it was just another quiet win, another line added to a growing list of outcomes no one at home needed to know about. What I didn't realize then was how close those numbers were to colliding with my family's obsession with status, how the work I was doing in silence was slowly reshaping the very world they were desperate to enter, and how, soon enough, staying invisible would no longer be an option. Once Harrington and Vale stabilized, something subtle but important shifted in my life. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden headlines or congratulatory dinners, but the work changed, the scale changed, and the expectations changed with it. Graham didn't treat me like a freelancer anymore. He looped me into conversations about long-term direction, expansion scenarios, what-if models that went beyond survival and into growth. We talked about new properties, secondary markets, acquisitions that looked risky on paper but made sense once you followed the data all the way through. I found myself running simulations late at night, not because anyone demanded it, but because the questions were interesting, complex, worth solving. For the first time, I wasn't just fixing problems, I was shaping outcomes. The contract was extended, then expanded. Retainers replaced one-off fees. Performance bonuses appeared in neat rows on my bank statements, numbers I double-checked because they still didn't quite feel real. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce anything. I upgraded my laptop, fixed the leak in my bathroom ceiling, swapped my aging hatchback for a reliable hybrid that didn't stall at red lights. Quiet changes, practical ones. At home, nothing changed at all. When I visited my parents, the conversation stayed exactly where they'd always been. Ethan's career, Ethan's trajectory, Ethan's future. My mother sent me photos of him and his fiancée at wine tastings and charity events, captions filled with exclamation points. "Can you imagine?" she'd write. "This is the kind of circle he's moving in now." Over dinner one night, Ethan casually mentioned that Harrington and Vale had hired a brilliant numbers guy to overhaul their strategy. "Some consultant," he said, impressed. "Genius type. If I play this right, I could get involved in some of their deals." My mother nodded approvingly. "That's where real opportunity is," she said. "Being around people who know how to make things happen." I took a sip of water and said nothing. I didn't correct them when they talked about Harrington and Vale like it was an abstract symbol of success. I didn't explain that the genius consultant had spent that morning arguing with Graham about whether they should cap holiday occupancy to protect long-term brand value. I didn't say that I'd built the models they were praising without knowing it. I let them talk. That was the strange part. As my professional life expanded, my presence in my family's narrative seemed to shrink. I became background noise, a footnote, something to manage around bigger plans. It was around this time that Ethan called me for coffee. He sounded excited in that particular way. I recognized immediately the tone he used whenever he thought he was leveling up. We met at a sleek downtown spot with concrete floors and overpriced cortados. He arrived in a tailored suit, even though it was a Saturday, smiling like he had already rehearsed the announcement. "I'm engaged," he said before I could even sit down. "To Leah Harrington." The name landed strangely. Familiar. Heavy. I repeated it slowly, just to be sure. "Harrington. As in Harrington and Vale?" He nodded, glowing. Her family owned the resort empire. They hosted charity events, political fundraisers. "Dad is freaking out," he said, laughing. In a good way. I smiled. I told him I was happy for him. And I meant it, at least the part of me that still wanted to be generous. We talked about the proposal, the ring, the way our parents reacted. He described their excitement like it was a shared victory. This was the doorway they'd always wanted. The world they'd admired from the outside, now finally opening. Then, his expression shifted. "There's a New Year's Eve engagement party," he said, tracing the rim of his cup, "at one of Leia's family resorts. It's big." I waited. For the invitation, for the logistical questions. Instead, he cleared his throat. "I think it's better if you sit this one out." The words felt oddly rehearsed. He explained the crowd. Donors, business partners, Politicians. A very particular environment. You know how you get, he said gently. You ask heavy questions. You make people uncomfortable. I asked him if he meant uncomfortable for me or embarrassing for him. He didn't answer. When I got home later that night, my parents were in the living room, voices low and urgent. I stopped in the hallway without meaning to. Your brother's in-laws are elite, my father said. We can't risk Nora rambling about money or calling out someone's business model. She'll humiliate us. My mother sighed. She doesn't mean to, but this could be Ethan's doorway into something better. We can't let her ruin it. Upstairs, my laptop was still open to a Harrington and Vale dashboard, the same logo embossed on the invitations to the party I was being excluded from, the same company whose survival I'd helped secure. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. Fine, I thought. If they wanted to hide me, let them. They had no idea how small their version of this story really was. They thought this party was about optics, about being seen in the right room with the right people. They didn't realize that somewhere inside that glittering resort, my work was already etched into the foundation, and that the world they were so desperate to enter had been relying on me long before they ever noticed the door was open. New Year's Eve came faster than I expected, the way deadlines always do when you're pretending not to care about them. The week between Christmas and the 31st felt suspended, like everything was waiting for something to break. My parents moved through the house with a nervous kind of excitement, talking about flights and outfits and which gift would be appropriate for the Harringtons. Ethan sent me a photo of the invitation once. Gold foil, embossed logo. Asterisk. Wish you could come. Asterisk, he wrote, as if the decision hadn't been made very deliberately without me. On the morning of the party, I stood in the doorway and watched them leave. My mother wore a new dress she absolutely couldn't afford without putting something on a credit card. My father adjusted a tie he'd bought on sale but was pretending was designer. Ethan looked polished and relaxed, already practicing the version of himself he planned to be that night. They waved, I waved back. The front door closed behind them, and the house went quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence. That night, Austin glittered with fireworks and rooftop parties, but I stayed in my apartment with takeout and my laptop open on the coffee table. I tried turning on a movie, but my phone kept lighting up. Photos from my mother of the resort lobby dripping in chandeliers. Videos from Ethan of champagne towers and a live band warming up. Leia walking down a grand staircase in a silver gown, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine. In one clip, I could hear my dad in the background, voice proud and loud. Asterisk. That's my son up there. He's marrying into the Harrington family. Asterisk. I stared at the screen until the images blurred, then locked my phone and turned it face down. Instead, I opened a different window, the analytics dashboard for Harrington and Vale's year-end performance. Real-time booking numbers flickered across the screen, rows of data refreshing every few seconds. Occupancy rates climbing, revenue bars filling in. The same brand my family was celebrating with, pouring champagne under chandeliers, was quietly surging because of work no one there could see. An email notification popped up in the corner of my screen. Subject line, asterisk, year-end update and a special request. Asterisk, it was from Graham Harrington. I clicked it open, half expecting a polite thank you and a spreadsheet attachment. Instead, he'd written a full paragraph about how transformative the past year had been. How the board had gone from panic to cautious optimism to genuine excitement. Asterisk, you didn't just tweak a few ads. Asterisk, he wrote. Asterisk, you changed the way we understand our business. Asterisk. At the bottom of the email was an attachment labeled Times Concept, Wall of Innovation.jpg asterisk. When I opened it, my breath caught. It was a mock-up of the entrance to one of their flagship resorts, a long wall lined with framed case studies, each one highlighting a pivotal moment in the company's survival. Soft lighting, gold frames, clean typography. Near the center was a familiar face. Mine. The caption beneath it read, asterisk data and growth strategist Nora Bennett. Asterisk. Below that, a concise summary of the turnaround I'd led. Dynamic pricing overhaul. Demand-driven campaigns. Recovery from post-pandemic slump. Guests would walk past this wall on their way into conferences and galas, glasses clinking, conversations flowing, my face watching quietly from the middle. Asterisk. We're planning to unveil this at a major partners and family event next season, asterisk, Graham wrote. Asterisk. We'd love to finally meet you in person and introduce you to some of the people whose jobs you helped save. Asterisk. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Across the room, my phone buzzed again. Another photo from my mother. Ethan and Laya under a shower of confetti, smiling so hard it almost hurt to look at. My parents blurred in the background, eyes shining, exactly where they believed they belonged. I imagined that somewhere not far from where they were standing, this wall might one day exist. My framed photo silently contradicting every story they'd ever told about me being a disappointment. How ironic it would be if the place they'd been so desperate to shield from my presence became the place that insisted on putting my face front and center. I replied to Graham with a simple yes. Told him I'd be honored to attend when the time came. Then I set my phone face down, leaned back on my couch, and listened to the distant echo of fireworks outside my window. They thought they had erased me from that night, that they'd finally found a world high enough, exclusive enough, polished enough that I couldn't reach it. They believed the story was over the moment they stepped into that resort without me. But the truth was sitting right there on my laptop screen, framed in gold. My name was already stitched into the foundation of their shiny new life. The numbers didn't lie. The impact didn't vanish just because it was unseen. And whether they liked it or not, the world they were celebrating in was already shaped by my work. They just hadn't realized yet that the person they were so determined to hide was already woven into every corner of their precious elite circle, waiting quietly for the moment the picture on that wall would stop being just a concept and start telling the truth out loud. The months after that, New Year's Eve passed in a strange blur. Like someone had quietly turned up the brightness on my life while my family kept acting as if I was still sitting in the dark. Harrington and Vale signed a long-term contract with me, then expanded it. What started as a recovery project turned into something much bigger. I was suddenly pulled into conversations about growth, not just survival. New properties, West Coast markets, Caribbean locations, late-night calls about whether shifting pricing during shoulder season could protect brand value without sacrificing volume. My days filled with dashboards and simulations. I ran models on acquisitions that looked reckless at first glance and made perfect sense once the numbers settled. I argued with executives about risk tolerance and long-term positioning, and they listened, not politely, seriously. They asked follow-up questions. They trusted my answers. My bank account reflected it too. Quietly, steadily, I replaced my old hatchback with a reliable hybrid, fixed the leak in my bathroom ceiling that I'd been ignoring for years, moved into a one-bedroom apartment that didn't feel like it might collapse during a thunderstorm. I didn't announce any of it. I didn't post about it. I knew exactly how my parents would react if I tried to explain performance-based contracts or retention bonuses. They would smile, nod, and ask if I'd thought about applying for a real job at a local office. And so I didn't explain. Meanwhile, Ethan's life looked like a highlight reel. My mother sent me constant updates, photos of him and Leia at wine tastings, charity balls, luxury retreats, screenshots of articles mentioning the Harrington name with captions like, "Asterisk, your brother was there last night. Can you imagine?" Asterisk. At Sunday dinners when I did show up, the conversation revolved around wedding plans, guest lists, and how incredible it was that our family would soon belong in rooms where people wore tuxedos and talked about offshore accounts like casual trivia. Once, over meatloaf, Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, "Graham is bringing in some kind of genius consultant for their new data strategy. Guy's basically a wizard with numbers. If I play this right, I could end up working on some of those deals." My mother's eyes lit up. "See, that's the kind of company you want to be around," she said. "People who know how to make things happen." I took a slow sip of water to hide my reaction. I wondered what she would say if I told her that the so-called wizard had spent that morning arguing with Graham about capping holiday occupancy to protect long-term brand value. That the wizard was me, but I didn't say anything. Let them talk about proximity to power. I was busy building it. Then, one afternoon in early fall, an email landed in my inbox that made me sit up straighter. It was from Graham's assistant. The subject line was simple and formal. Asterisk partners and family gala final details. Asterisk. The message explained that Harrington and Vale were hosting a major event at their Miami flagship, part celebration of the company's turnaround. Part engagement gala for Leah Harrington and Ethan Bennett. Graham and Celeste wanted to honor key partners that evening, including me. Asterisk. They'd like you front and center when we unveil the Wall of Innovation. Asterisk. Attached was the official invitation. Even through a screen, it looked heavy. Embossed lettering, clean design. My name printed near the top of the guest list under a heading labeled Times Strategic Partners. Asterisk. Ethan's name appeared lower, under Times Family of the Groom. Asterisk. I stared at it longer than I probably should have. I hadn't heard anything from my parents yet about this event, but I could already imagine how the conversation would go. They'd brag about being invited to an ultra-exclusive gala at Leia's favorite resort. They'd talk about how limited the guest list was, how only the right people were allowed in, and somewhere between the flights and the outfits, they'd quietly assume I wasn't coming. Again. The difference this time was simple. The Harringtons were not inviting me as Ethan's awkward sister. They were inviting me as the person who had changed the trajectory of their business. I called Graham to confirm details. He sounded genuinely excited. "We've been telling everyone about you," he said. "I can't wait to see their faces when they realize the person behind those numbers is real." After we hung up, I leaned back in my chair and let the irony settle in. My family had spent an entire year trying to manage me out of their perfect narrative, convinced I would embarrass them in front of their elite in-laws. They believed my presence was a risk. But at this party, in that glittering Miami resort, there would be no hiding me. I wasn't attending as a complication or a liability. I was attending because they wanted me there, because my work demanded it. They thought they were climbing into a world where I didn't belong. They had no idea they were about to walk straight into a room where my name was already etched in gold, waiting for them to finally see what they had spent so long refusing to acknowledge. The Harrington flagship in Miami looked exactly like the kind of place my parents fantasized about when they flipped through glossy magazines. Marble floors stretched wide beneath towering palms in oversized planters. Floral arrangements sat on polished tables, dramatic and expensive, the kind that probably cost more than my first car. Everything gleamed, everything whispered money. The air itself felt different, warm and humming with it. I arrived early, just as Graham's assistant had requested. Not as anyone's sister, not as an afterthought. A coordinator met me near the entrance and handed me a badge with my name printed in clean black letters. Nora Bennett, Data and Growth Strategist. Asterisk, asterisk. Seeing it there, so simple and official, made something twist in my chest. For once, my identity wasn't being softened into times she does something online, times she works from home. Asterisk, it was precise. It was true. Inside the foyer, the Wall of Innovation stretched along one side, exactly like the mock-up. Gold frames, soft lighting angled just right. Each case study told a piece of the company's survival story. Numbers turned into narratives, decisions turned into momentum, and near the center was my frame. My photo looked calmer than I felt, more confident. My name etched beneath it, my work summarized in clean, undeniable language. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the reality of it settle. This wasn't symbolic, it was permanent. Graham and Celeste spotted me and crossed the room immediately, both smiling with the kind of warmth that wasn't rehearsed. They introduced me to board members, department heads, people whose livelihoods were tied to decisions I had helped shape. We talked strategy, future plans, expansion. I laughed at a CFO's joke about forecasting and forgot briefly about everything else. For the first hour, I was exactly where I belonged. Then I heard my mother's voice. It floated in from the lobby, high and nervous. "Oh, wow. Ethan, look at that chandelier." I turned just enough to see them enter. My father in a suit that suddenly looked cheaper under the lights. My mother clutching her bag like it might run away. Ethan and Leah walking ahead, confident, polished, ready to be admired. My first instinct was old and automatic. Shrink. Step back. Let someone taller block the view. But the staff had been trained. One of them approached me with a smile. "Miss Bennett, could we get you closer to the wall? Mr. Harrington would like you nearby for the announcement." So instead of hiding, I moved forward. I found myself standing just a few feet from my own framed photo as my family crossed the foyer. They didn't see me at first. Their eyes were on the decor, the people, the promise of what this night meant for them. Celeste gently tapped her champagne glass, and the room softened into a hush. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Tonight is about family and partnership, about the people who held this company up when things looked impossible." She gestured toward the wall. "Over the past year, we built this to remind ourselves that numbers are not just charts. They are people. People who changed everything when we needed it most." She stepped closer to my frame and smiled. "One of those people is someone very dear to us now." She pointed directly at my photo. "This is Nora Bennett." The room shifted. My parents froze mid-sentence. Ethan's head snapped toward the sound of my name. Celeste read the plaque out loud, each word landing clean and sharp. Data and growth strategist. The mind behind the turnaround that kept these resorts alive during the worst of travel's collapse. She turned, her gaze following the line from the frame to where I stood. "Nora," she said, her eyes widening. Then louder, delighted, unmistakable. "Nora Bennett, you're here. You're Ethan's sister." Heads swiveled. Dozens of them. From me to Ethan. From Ethan to my parents. The silence that followed said more than any speech could have. Graham stepped up beside Celeste, his expression polite but suddenly sharp as his attention settled on my family. "You never told us your daughter was our Nora," he said to my parents. My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. My mother stammered, We didn't realize you knew her like that. She does some kind of computer work. We didn't think it was important for tonight." A few nearby guests exchanged looks. "Important?" Graham repeated, his tone calm but firm. "Without her, this party doesn't happen. This building doesn't stay this full. Half the people in this room would be updating their resumes." Celeste laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension, but her words carried weight. "We've been bragging about her for months," she said. "I can't imagine hiding someone like Nora." Ethan finally reached me, his face pale. "You didn't tell me you were working with them," he said under his breath. I met his eyes. "You didn't ask." Later, away from the crowd, my parents cornered me in a quiet hallway. My mother's voice shook. "You made us look like fools." I looked at her calmly. "No," I said. "I just stopped making myself smaller." When Graham later introduced me on stage as a key partner, the applause felt different from anything I'd ever chased growing up. It wasn't polite. It wasn't conditional. It was earned. Standing there under that soft golden light, I understood something clearly for the first time. The moment I'd been afraid of for years, the one where everyone looked at me, wasn't my humiliation. It was theirs. After the applause faded and the music swelled back into the room, something inside me finally settled. Not with triumph, not with anger, with clarity. My parents didn't approach me right away. They hovered at the edge of conversations, suddenly unsure of their footing in a space they had dreamed about for years. When they did come over, it wasn't with pride. It was with confusion. My mother's voice was low and shaky. "You made us look like fools," she said, like that was the deepest wound she could imagine. I looked at her and realized how tired I was of carrying that weight for them. "I didn't make you look like anything," I said gently. "I just stopped pretending." My father tried to recover his authority, the way he always had. "You could have warned us, Nora," he said. "We would have prepared differently." "Prepared how? By inviting me this time? By telling people you were proud of me only after someone richer said it first? I didn't ask the questions out loud. I didn't need to. The answers were already hanging between us." Ethan stood there too, eyes glassy, torn between embarrassment and something that looked suspiciously like resentment. "You know how Mom and Dad are," he said quietly. "We just wanted everything to go smoothly. You understand that, right? You still want to be part of this family." That was the moment I'd been circling for years without realizing it. The moment when belonging came with conditions. When love required me to be quieter, smaller, easier to manage. "I will always be your sister," I told him, "and I will always be their daughter. But I'm done begging to sit at a table where the price of admission is pretending I'm less than what I am." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We were just afraid," she whispered. "Afraid you'd embarrass us." I nodded. "And tonight you found out the only embarrassing thing was how little you believed in me. That was it. No shouting, no dramatic exit, just the truth, finally spoken without shaking." Back in the ballroom, Graham introduced me properly. Not as a surprise, not as a twist, as a partner, as someone whose work had changed the direction of an entire company. The applause that followed wasn't polite or obligatory. It was the kind that comes from recognition, not obligation, from people who didn't care how I dressed or whether I knew the right small talk, as long as I showed up with clarity and results. Standing there under that soft golden light, I understood something I wish I'd learned much earlier. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud, it isn't cruel, it doesn't require anyone to be torn down. Sometimes it's simply choosing to stop handing your worth to people who only know how to discount it. My parents had to walk past that framed photo of me every time they crossed the foyer that night, my name etched into the wall of the world they worshipped. They were the ones shrinking now, avoiding eye contact, rehearsing apologies they didn't quite know how to give. I didn't chase them. I didn't wait for anything. I just kept walking, shoulders back, finally understanding that the real glow-up wasn't being accepted by them. It was learning to accept myself first. If you've ever been the one your family tried to hide, the one they softened introductions for, the one they warned to not say too much or not ruin the moment, I want you to hear this clearly. Their inability to see your value does not erase the value itself. You are allowed to build a life that honors who you are, even if the people closest to you don't understand it. You are allowed to love them and still say no when their expectations crush you. You are allowed to succeed quietly, loudly, or not at all, on your own terms. And sometimes, the most satisfying moment isn't when they finally clap for you. It's when you realize you don't need them to. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to distance yourself from people who didn't see your worth, tell me in the comments. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear tonight. And if you've been shrinking yourself to make others comfortable, let this be your sign to stop.